The Khmer Rouge are still operating from their bases in the mountains in the west and northwest.
The system was that people would be arrested either in Phnom Penh or in the countryside, brought here and forced to write confessions under torture, and after that then they would be killed.
The Cambodian forces are still very small and consist mainly of militia or home guard, although they do have good weapons. American M16 carbines, probably captured in South Vietnam in 1975.
At the moment, while the Pol Pot regime are active in the border, the Cambodians feel that they need the Vietnamese here to protect them.
For 3.5 years, this was the place where Kampuchea's communist masters, the Khmer Rouge, interrogated and then exterminated anyone they suspected of opposing them. 20,000 people died in this grim prison, once a secondary school, and at the peak, one day in May 1978, 582 people were killed here. Tuol Sleng held between 1,000 and 1,500 prisoners at any one time and had 200 guards, interrogators, torturers and other staff. The cells in which prisoners were shackled to the floor were just big enough for a man to lie down in. The killing graph rose sharply from 1975, when 154 prisoners were taken in, to something like 10,000 for 1978, Pol Pot's last year in power. As in Belsen, the clothes of the victims make a grim pile. Prisoners being interrogated and tortured were chained to beds like these. The instruments of torture and often of death have been left exactly where they were. Like the Gestapo before it, Pol Pot's secret police, the Gall, kept meticulous records, particularly of confessions extracted under torture. This gruesome archive, which has never been filmed before, is being studied in detail by a young Australian historian, Ben Kiernan. I asked him what he'd discovered from his research.
The system was that people would be arrested either in Phnom Penh or in the countryside, brought here and forced to write confessions under torture. There are some documents which are reports from the interrogators to their superiors explaining what methods of torture they've used, such as in the case of Phnom, who was a well-known revolutionary minister. He was stuffed with water and beaten 5 or 6 times. There's documents remaining which report that. The confessions were done in many different versions. In Phnom's case, at least 7 times he was forced to rewrite his confession. After each time he would finish the writing and the confession would be sent to a man called Duc, who was the director of the prison under the Pol Pot regime, and he would go through the confession, correcting in red on the side, in the margins, pointing out things to be changed or things to be added in or left out. You can see Duc's writing here with his signature at the bottom here, dated April 77.
Now, what happened when the confession was complete, in the case, say, of Phnom?
Well, when they were satisfied that he had confessed neatly enough, and it was very important to have it neatly. Some of the later versions are written out with no spelling mistakes, no cross-outs. After all the corrections became very methodical, and after that, then they would be killed.
These skulls, composed into a horrific map of Kampuchea, come partly from Tuol Sleng and partly from mass graves in various parts of the country. There are plenty. In another room hang paintings by one of the 12 survivors. They were saved when the Vietnamese captured Phnom Penh. No one else left Tuol Sleng alive. Another painting shows the water torture that was a speciality here. Recently, a document has been found in which the torturers noted down precisely how long it took a body to float to the surface after death. Another of the dozen survivors, Ong Pech, is now the director of the camp. He wasn't killed, he says, because he was the only person who could keep the machinery of the place running. I asked him what he remembered most vividly about his 2 years here.
In the 2 years that I was here, I would hear people screaming when I was working here, the prisoners who were being tortured in the building next door. And sometimes we'd hear people being tortured with electricity and they would fall over in shock. Sometimes they would attach electrical wires to the testicles or to the ears of the prisoner. Sometimes they would cut people's stomachs open and take out their liver.
Perhaps nothing shows better just how terrible these people were than the fact that they used to issue invitations to senior members of the staff to come and watch the torture. One such invitation, found recently, said, "It should be good tonight." Sandy Gall, News at 10 at the Tuol Sleng Extermination Centre. When the Khmer Rouge attacked the Vietnamese border in late 1978 with 3 divisions, they did a thorough job, killing a number of border officials and local villagers and destroying the border post. A few weeks later, at Christmas time, the Vietnamese army crossed the border in force and a week later had captured Phnom Penh. It was an Oriental blitzkrieg that overthrew the genocidal regime of Pol Pot and established the Vietnamese army throughout the country. Today there are reported to be up to 200,000 Vietnamese troops in Kampuchea, mainly in the north and west, where 40,000 Khmer Rouge have managed to cling on. A few hundred yards up the road, the Cambodian border post with the new flag is more of a symbol than anything else. But the road gangs are real enough. Vietnamese men and some strapping Kampuchean women. Under Pol Pot, they'd have been dressed entirely in black. All along the border, the Khmer Rouge sowed a series of minefields, which are still there. Apart from a strip along the road itself, a lot of the land is still not being cultivated. Halfway between the border and Phnom Penh, we came to a village where food was being distributed, which apparently happens on a fairly haphazard basis. This handout was certainly not rigged for the cameras. No one knew we were coming. Local officials were doling out rations of Russian maize and Red Cross flour, a little under £2 per person per month. Although the huge international aid program to Kampuchea has literally saved a nation, the next few months, until the rice harvest in December, will be lean ones, according to aid officials. But at this particular village, I did not see a single child, nor adult, who was obviously suffering from extreme hunger. The crucial thing now, everyone agrees, is that the peasants should plant up the seed rice, which is coming into the country in increasing quantities. One estimate suggests that 60 to 70% of the rice paddy has been planted up, and that a good harvest is in the making. The great Mekong River is as important to Kampuchea as the Nile is to Egypt, and it is along its basin that most of the rice is grown. The ruthless policies of the Khmer Rouge and then the turmoil of the war with the Vietnamese that followed effectively destroyed Kampuchean rice production. But now it looks as if the worst is over, at least in this part of the country. Phnom Penh, the capital, once a ghost town, emptied of its 2 million inhabitants by order of Pol Pot, has undergone an amazing transformation. People have poured back from all parts of the country where they'd been driven by mass deportations. There's still a temporary, eerie quality about the place, but in the early morning sunlight, the ghosts have been banished. Sandy Gall, News at 10, Phnom Penh. When the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh in 1975, they ordered everyone to leave the city, and it stayed empty for 4 years. Now it's rapidly coming back to life. Every morning, Sundays included, the market opens at 6, and peasants come in loaded with produce from their private plots. The Khmer Rouge insisted on complete collectivization. Now, private enterprise is being encouraged again, and the market is remarkably well stocked for a country that was on the verge of starvation a year ago. Rice is plentiful but expensive on the open market. Tobacco is homegrown but also expensive. But the more exotic things like nail varnish and mock scotch, this one is called Blackie Label, come down the long trail from Thailand by ox cart and motor bicycle. Gold is the basis of the economy, and surprisingly, the Kampucheans still have some gold left. There also seems to be plenty of cash about. The Khmer Rouge abolished money altogether, but last May, the Vietnamese-backed government introduced a new riel, which is officially rated at 4 to the dollar. All over Phnom Penh, little shops have sprung up, especially bicycle repairers, who seem to be able to make anything work. There's even a French bakery. The owner says he thinks he'll be able to operate as a private concern for a year or two. Like several other bakeries, he was helped to start up by Oxfam. Bill Yates, Oxfam's local director, says they will have put about £20 million into Kampuchea by the end of the year. I asked him what they'd done in particular to get Phnom Penh back on its feet.
Our major concern since the beginning has been public health, really. There are certainly at least 500,000 people back in Phnom Penh now. And one of the earliest projects that we got involved in was the waterworks, getting a clean water supply to the people in the city, to the hospitals as well as the population. We put a fair bit of money into that, with chemicals, spare parts, equipment, that sort of thing. So that we're quite happy about.
And the water's now drinkable, is it?
The water's absolutely potable. We have tests carried out every couple of months, and it's been perfectly good. The other major thing in Phnom Penh has been getting the electricity works going again. And that, we've put about £75,000 into that. Seems a lot of money, but again, it serves all the hospitals, the schools, the public buildings, as well as private houses, and of course the factories. There are, say, 30 or 40 factories in Phnom Penh that are using that electricity supply now. So that's those are perhaps the two major initiatives in the city. Otherwise, industrially, we've put a fair bit of money into the textile industry. We had the option we could have brought in cloth, but we felt it was better to bring in cotton yarn and dye stuffs and get the factories going again. It's producing up to 5,000 meters a day of cloth, and there's 500 people working there. Well, that's jobs and wages, and it's getting the whole movement of the city and indeed of the country back on its feet.
The Western aid program has undoubtedly kept Kampuchea going. It has literally saved a nation. Like so many towns in Kampuchea, the provincial capital of Kampong Cham was partly destroyed in the war. Much of what was left was smashed up by the Khmer Rouge. In their determination to go back to a medieval economy, they seem to take a vindictive pleasure in destroying everything mechanical. The 12,000 inhabitants of Kampong Cham, there used to be 100,000, camp out in the ruins of their former homes. Kampong Cham was particularly hard hit by the Khmer Rouge, and there still is a fair-sized group of them operating in the jungle in the area. Hence this show of force by the new and still puny Kampuchean army. The Technical University, once the second biggest in the country, is like a bomb site. But the Khmer Rouge destroyed much more than bricks and mortar. Outside every town, there's gruesome evidence of their policy of mass murder. The stench of death still hangs over this place, just outside Kampong Cham, where there are said to be more mass graves than anywhere else in the whole of Kampuchea. These people were killed first, and then their bodies thrown down this well, about 40 feet deep. And when they found it, it was full right up to the top. This was the killing ground, not only for Kampong Cham, but for miles around. The locals say they drove the victims here in lorries while the loudspeakers blared and told them they were being taken to a reception. Exactly what kind of a reception only became apparent when, after a short walk through the bush, the prisoners found themselves standing in front of newly dug pits 12 feet deep. Then they were killed, usually by blows to the back of the neck, and their bodies thrown into the waiting graves. We saw a score of them in an area over a mile long. No one knows how many people were killed and buried here. Estimates range from 10 or 20 to possibly 30,000. No one knows either exactly how many Kampucheans were killed. The Kampucheans say 3 million out of a total population of 7 or 8 million. Most Western observers say around 2 million. Whatever the figure, which can never be accurately known, the Khmer Rouge not only wiped out 9/10 of the middle class and huge numbers of the urban population, they also killed thousands of peasants. Most of these people are believed to be peasants killed in 1978 at the very end. The destruction of a quarter of the nation has left a huge number of orphans. This orphanage in Kompong Cham is typical. 110 children between 4 and 16, all of whom have lost both parents, and only 4 teachers. It's supported by 3 Western charities, the World Council of Churches, World Vision and Oxfam, who provide an allowance of about £3 per child per month. It has practically no equipment, the children only learn to read and write, and very few books. The illustrations, predictably mostly war pictures, are done by the children themselves. Even the simplest toys are hugely prized. The kitchen looks positively Dickensian, and the staple diet is, of course, rice. The headmistress says the children are always hungry, but they look better fed and clothed than the children in the town, and they do have some sort of organized existence. Their past is one of horror. Their parents killed by one of the most inhumane political systems ever imposed on a hapless country. Their future, however hard, must be brighter. Sandy Gall, News at 10, Kompong Cham. For hundreds of years, the Khmers were famous for their classical dancing. Then came the Khmer Rouge, who stopped all forms of cultural activity. But last August, the ballet school in Phnom Penh opened again after being closed for 5 years. 90% of the pupils are orphans. Their parents were either killed by the Khmer Rouge or died of hunger or disappeared. They're all the children of dancers or actors, which explains, they say, how despite so little training, they're already so good. Most of the dances are traditional, like this extract from The King of the Monkeys. But one of the staff has written a new dance, which is to be performed at the official opening. It's a rustic dance, but has more spontaneity and less propaganda than you'd expect of a communist creation. The Royal Ballet was the pride of the old Cambodian court. Now it's called the State Ballet, but the beauty of the dancers and the sumptuousness of the costumes is unchanged. It too has just been started up again, although performances are only put on for visiting VIPs. A 1,000 years ago, these same dances were being performed in the ancient Khmer capital of Angkor Wat, and were captured in its golden sandstone. But even Angkor is not above politics today. The Cambodian authorities are apparently so worried about Khmer Rouge activity in this area that they've actually banned all foreign visitors from Angkor Wat, for the time being at any rate, and we had to give our guide the slip to get here at all. When you do get here, you realize 2 things immediately. The first is that the Khmer Rouge did a great deal of damage to this unique series of temples in the jungle. Just how much is very hard to discover. And secondly, because there's no proper care and maintenance, no conservation program, Angkor Wat is actually in danger of falling down. Angkor was lost in the jungle for hundreds of years before being rediscovered by a Frenchman called Grolier, who did much to save it. During the war, the odd shell fell on it, but it was the Khmer Rouge who did most of the damage, destroying virtually all the Buddhas, of which there were about 2,000. This was the place of 1,000 Buddhas. Now only a few dozen remain, and many are headless. One famous foot of the Buddha remains more or less intact, the other was destroyed. It is in fact a beautifully carved and gilded calendar. It's impossible to tell where Khmer Rouge vandalism left off and subsequent looting started. A lot of heads have been stolen from Angkor, partly by Vietnamese soldiers and partly by gangs from Thailand working for unscrupulous dealers. We were shown these recently severed heads, hacked off clumsily by an axe. Police arrived to investigate another robbery while we were actually there. The sole guide at Angkor, who wasn't killed by the Khmer Rouge, told me looting was going on all the time. He says they hope to start a conservation program soon, but despite the presence of young Kampuchean guards, it's doubtful if it will stop the steady destruction of one of the great architectural masterpieces of the world. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about the Kampuchean scene today is the flood of consumer goods that's pouring in from the Thai border, just west of here, to the small town of Sisupon, and then on to Battambang, the second city in the country, and finally to the capital, Phnom Penh. The peasants and their ox carts go to the border for their free handout of rice from the Western agencies, although Kampuchean officials claim that the Khmer Rouge intercept the rice and then sell it to the peasants. Once the rice reaches Sisupon, fleets of lorries run a shuttle service to other parts of the province. But the fancy goods, the sandals, cigarettes and bolts of cloth, come in on the back of motor bicycles. One motorbike smuggler told me most of the traffic was destined for Vietnam, which is starved of Western consumer goods. A month ago, the Vietnamese banned their nationals from the trafficking, but the Kampucheans can still sell to the Vietnamese. Just about every other man on the road in Battambang has a Honda, bought in Thailand for between £400 and £500, a lot of money in a country that was on the verge of starvation a year ago. The smaller operators, the cigarette and sandal merchants, use another means of transport, the train, which runs irregularly between Battambang and Phnom Penh. People still crowd onto the flat cars in front of the engine, which are supposed to set off any mines on the track, despite the fact that in the past 3 months the Khmer Rouge have attacked the train twice, killing over 150 passengers the first time and over 50 the second. Roadblocks are frequent outside the towns, but the militiamen are not concerned with ordinary smuggling. They're looking for arms or explosives being brought in by the Khmer Rouge, who are still operating from their bases in the mountains in the west and northwest. The Kampuchean forces are still very small and consist mainly of militia or home guard. They come in all shapes and sizes, a bit of a Fred Karno's army in fact, although they do have good weapons, American M16 carbines, which probably were captured in South Vietnam in 1975. The real muscle is of course supplied by the Vietnamese, who are reported to have 200,000 men in Kampuchea. They don't like being filmed very much, except when they're working in the fields. And they camouflage themselves so well that it's easy to miss them, even when they're just off the road under the trees. And it's a rare sight to see their armor on the move. In fact, the Vietnamese keep a very low profile. But what does a Kampuchean think about them?
The Vietnamese are the only troop which fight Pol Pot, who is their first enemy. See, and also, many people in the countryside and in the city told me that the Vietnamese don't bother them. They are allowed to do whatever they want, and sometimes they get on well with one another and they help with one another with their works. So it's fine for everyone. And
but in the long run, surely, Kampucheans want to run their own country, want to run their own affairs, so they want to see the Vietnamese go.
Yes, in the long run, yes. But at the moment, it's a different thing, because the Pol Pot regime, why they are active in the border, why they get supported from the American, from China, from Thailand and other countries which vote for them at the UN, the Cambodians feel that they need the Vietnamese here to protect them.
The Vietnamese say that the situation here is irreversible, by which they mean they have no intention of allowing the Khmer Rouge to return to power. Their army controls 9/10 of the country, and they effectively run the administration. There's a Vietnamese advisor in every key ministry in Phnom Penh, and what he says goes. Not that the Kampucheans seem to object very much to this. They seem to be genuinely grateful to the Vietnamese for getting rid of the Khmer Rouge, who killed 2 million people in less than 4 years. But it's the longer term that doesn't look so good for the Kampucheans. Whether they withdraw or not,
the Vietnamese will clearly insist on having a government here of their own choice, carrying out the policies they want. Any idea of the Vietnamese voluntarily giving up their total hold over this country is about as likely as the Mekong River starting to flow backwards. Sandy Gall, News at 10, Kampuchea.